That morning in San Diego promised to be like any other. The early summer sun filtered through the slats of the blinds, drawing golden lines across the kitchen tiles. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of toasted bread, creating that familiar atmosphere that, despite everything, comforted me each morning. I glanced at the clock, 7:30. As always, I had woken before James to prepare breakfast. While I spread orange marmalade on my toast, I heard James's heavy footsteps descending the stairs. He entered the kitchen with a furrowed brow, his eyes fixed on his phone. He didn't even look at me as he sat down at the table. I poured him his coffee, black and unsweetened, just the way he liked it. "Thanks," he murmured without taking his eyes off his screen. It was the first word he'd spoken to me in 2 days. I sat across from him, absent-mindedly stirring my latte. The silence between us was so thick I could almost touch it. When had we come to this? I remembered our early years together, when breakfast was filled with laughter and plans for the future. Now, we barely met each other's eyes. "What are your plans for today?" I ventured, trying to start a conversation. James looked up from his phone as if he'd just remembered I was there. "Work," he replied curtly. "I have an important meeting with some investors in Los Angeles. Don't wait up for dinner." I nodded, accustomed to his absences. James worked for a construction firm and lately spent more time at the office than at home, or so he claimed. A part of me wondered if he was really working that hard or if there was something else going on, but I quickly brushed those thoughts aside. I didn't want to fall into the trap of mistrust. "By the way," James added as he got up to refill his coffee, "my sister Sophie is arriving today with her 3 kids. They'll be staying with us for a while." The news caught me off guard. "What? Your sister is coming to stay? Why didn't you tell me?" James shrugged as if it were no big deal. "I forgot to mention it. She's been having some problems with her husband and needs a place to stay until things sort themselves out. But James, we don't have room. Where are they going to sleep?" "I figured they could use your home office and our bedroom. We can sleep on the sleeper sofa in the living room." I was left speechless. Not only would I have to give up my workspace, but also my own bed, and all without consulting me. "James, you can't make decisions like this without talking to me first. This is my home too. What do you want me to do?" he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "She's my sister. She's going through a rough time and needs our help." "I thought you'd understand." "Of course I understand you want to help your sister," I said, trying to stay calm. "But you could have given me a heads up. We could have looked for other options together." James snorted in exasperation. "There are no other options, Mary. I need you to give up your room and your car. She needs them more than you do. Besides, I won't tolerate a no from you." His words hit me like a slap. I blinked several times, stunned, searching his face for any sign he was joking. But his gaze was cold and calculating, a look I had seen too often lately, always preceding some sort of imposition. Something inside me stirred, a spark of rebellion I thought long extinguished. "No," I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. "My car and my room are not up for negotiation." I saw his expression change. His eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched. For a moment, I thought he was about to yell as he had so many times before. But what he did next was worse. With a sudden, uncontrolled movement, James flung the remnants of his coffee cup at me. The hot liquid splattered on my hands and torso, burning me slightly. I cried out in surprise and pain, leaping from my chair. "What are you doing?" I exclaimed, incredulous. James stood, imposing, his face flushed with anger. "I've told you 1,000 times, Mary. In this house, what I say goes. If you don't like it, you know where the door is." I stood there trembling as he gathered his briefcase and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned and shot me one last look of contempt. "When I get back tonight, I expect everything to be ready for Sophie and the kids. And I don't want to hear a single complaint." The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone in the kitchen. The ensuing silence was deafening. I leaned against the counter, trying to process what had just happened. My hands shook and I felt a knot in my throat. I looked around. The kitchen, which moments before had been warm and inviting, now felt cold and hostile. I saw coffee stains on the floor and a mark on my blouse, and something inside me shattered. How had we come to this? When had the man I fell in love with turned into this strange, authoritarian, aggressive person? Questions swirled in my mind as I mechanically began to clean up the mess. I remembered the day I met James, 10 years ago, at a beach party in Pacific Beach. He had been charming, fun, full of dreams and plans for the future. I fell for his smile, the way he made me laugh, the way he made me feel special. The early years were wonderful. Trips, shared projects, endless nights of conversation. But little by little, things changed. First, there were small details, dismissive remarks about my work, decisions made without consulting me, broken promises. Then came more frequent arguments, prolonged silences, unexplained absences. And what about me? I adapted. I conceded, justifying his behavior over and over. He's just stressed from work, I told myself. Things will improve eventually, and there was always a win that never came. As I scrubbed the shattered cup, I realized something had changed that morning. It wasn't just the coffee incident. It was as if a veil had lifted from my eyes and, for the first time in a long while, I saw things clearly. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't let James treat me as if I were merely a possession, as if my opinions and feelings didn't matter. The woman I had been when I met him, the young, determined dreamer, what would she say if she saw me now? I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I saw a 35-year-old woman with her hair tied back in a careless bun, dark circles under her eyes, and an expression of constant fatigue. But in those eyes, I also saw a glimmer of something I thought lost: dignity. In that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for James to return. I wasn't going to prepare anything for Sophie and her kids. I wasn't going to give in any further. With trembling but resolute hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Lucy? It's Mary. I need your help." My sister answered on the second ring, her concerned voice a reminder of how long it had been since we'd spoken. James had never approved of our closeness. "Mary? Are you okay? Did something happen?" I took a deep breath before replying. "I need to get out of here, Lucy. Can I stay with you for a few days?" There was a moment of silence. When Lucy spoke again, her voice was determined. "Of course. Do you want me to come get you?" "No," I replied, feeling a strange calm wash over me. "I'll pack up and leave as soon as I can. I'll call you when I'm on my way." I hung up and stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than ever, urging me to move. And so I did. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, each step feeling like the first on a long journey, a journey toward myself, toward the woman I'd forgotten how to be. As I opened the closet and began gathering clothes, a mix of emotions overwhelmed me: fear, sadness, but also, surprisingly, a spark of hope. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: I could no longer stay here. The morning that began like any other had become the turning point of my life. As I packed my essentials into a small suitcase, clothes, important documents, and a few cherished keepsakes, I was astonished at how little I really needed. Something inside me awakened then, something that had been dormant for far too long: the need to reclaim my life. It wouldn't be easy, I knew. I'd have to confront not only James, but also my own fears and insecurities. But for the first time in ages, I felt I had the strength to do it. Determined, I pulled out my old planner from the nightstand drawer, searching for phone numbers I hadn't used in years, former colleagues from the school, friends from college, my old boss from the tutoring center. I would need all the help I could get to rebuild my life. As I dialed numbers and left messages, a part of me wondered how James would react when he got home and found me gone. Would he be furious? Would he try to find me? Or would he simply shrug and carry on as if I'd never existed? The thought of his reaction, which once would have paralyzed me with fear, now only strengthened my resolve. I was no longer going to live in fear of his outbursts, his mood swings, his demands. It was time to live for myself. I went downstairs to the kitchen to grab something to eat before leaving. While making a sandwich, my eyes wandered to the fridge, adorned with magnets and notes, photos from vacations, grocery lists, reminders of appointments, fragments of a life that now seemed belonged to someone else. I picked up one photo, a snapshot of James and me at Mission Bay, smiling and seemingly happy, and slipped it into my purse, not sure why. Perhaps as a reminder of what we once had, or what I thought we had. The sound of my phone startled me. It was a message from Lucy. "How are you holding up? Need me to come get you?" Her concern touched me and gave me the final push I needed. I quickly replied, "I'm fine. I'll be leaving in half an hour. See you soon." I returned to the bedroom and changed. I chose a simple yet pretty dress, one James despised because he said it made me look too independent. I fixed my hair and applied a touch of makeup, not to impress anyone but for myself. It was a small act of rebellion, a way to reclaim my identity. Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time. Every room held memories, both good and bad. The living room where we'd spent countless nights watching movies in our early days together. The kitchen where we'd had so many arguments. The little office that had been mine, now earmarked for his sister. Every corner told a story, and I realized I was ready to write a new one far from these walls. In the foyer, I paused in front of the mirror. The woman who looked back was different. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but also determination. I grabbed my car keys, my purse, and my suitcase. With one last look at what had been my home for the past decade, I opened the door and stepped out. The late morning sun blinded me for a moment. The neighborhood was quiet, only the distant bark of a dog and the hum of traffic on the main avenue could be heard. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the warm San Diego air that smelled of orange blossoms and the sea scents that had always meant home to me. As I walked to my car, each step felt like a triumph, a silent shout of independence. My legs trembled slightly, but my resolve was firm. I opened the trunk, loaded my luggage, and sat behind the wheel. For a moment, I sat motionless, hands on the steering wheel. A part of me still couldn't believe what I was doing. Was I really leaving behind 10 years of my life? Was I making the right decision? But then I recalled James's cold glare that morning, the burning coffee on my skin, and all the small humiliations accumulated over the years. Yes, I was doing the right thing. I started the engine and, with one last glance at the house I'd once called home, drove off. I didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem like a threat, it felt like a promise. A promise of freedom, rediscovery, and a life that was finally mine again. As I drove through the familiar streets of my old neighborhood, I felt a whirlwind of emotions, fear, yes, but also a strange euphoria. I was leaving behind a life of shadows and silence, and although the road ahead was uncertain, I knew it was the right one. San Diego unfolded before me as if I were seeing it for the first time, the modern buildings, the palm trees lining the avenues, the brilliant blue sky. Everything seemed more vibrant, more real. Or perhaps it was I who was awakening from a long slumber. Heading toward Lucy's apartment in the Ruzafa neighborhood, my mind buzzed with chaotic thoughts. How would I rebuild my life? Could I return to teaching? Would I have the strength to keep moving forward? But above all these questions, one certainty shone brightly. I was free. For the first time in years, decisions about my life belonged solely to me. The mid-morning traffic gave me time to reflect. I had wasted so many years trying to save something that never made me happy. But now, with each mile I put between myself and James, I felt I was reclaiming a piece of who I truly was. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was mine, and that was enough. The journey to Lucy's place felt both endless and too short. Every red light was a moment to doubt, to consider turning back. But I pressed on, my knuckles white from gripping the wheel, my heart pounding fiercely. Finally, I reached the vibrant, historic streets of the Ruzafa neighborhood where Lucy lived. I parked in front of a colorful modernist building typical of this bohemian area. Before stepping out, I took several deep breaths, trying to calm my nerves. Lucy was waiting at the door. As soon as she saw me, she ran over and wrapped me in a tight, almost desperate hug. No words were needed. We stood there in silence for a long moment as I fought to hold back tears I'd been suppressing for hours. "Come on, upstairs," Lucy finally said, taking my suitcase. "I'll make you some tea and you can tell me everything." Lucy's apartment was small but cozy, full of plants and adorned with paintings and photographs. I sat on the sofa while she headed to the kitchen. I absorbed every detail: the knitted curtains our grandmother had made, the stacks of books on every available surface, the scent of incense and coffee. Everything was so different from the house I'd just left, so full of life and personality. Lucy returned with 2 steaming mugs and sat beside me. "Tell me," she said simply. And so I did. I told her everything: the incident that morning, yes, but also years of small humiliations, of control disguised as love, of abandoned dreams and stifling silences. I talked for what felt like hours, emptying myself, releasing a burden I had carried for far too long. Lucy listened in silence, holding my hand and offering tissues as the tears finally came. When I finished, she hugged me again. "I'm so sorry, Mary," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have seen it. I should have done something." I shook my head. "It's not your fault, Lou. I didn't want to see what was happening. I convinced myself it was normal, that every couple went through this. But now you're here," Lucy said with a small smile. "You've taken the first step, and I'm so proud of you." Her words comforted me more than I could say. For the first time in years, I felt safe, understood. "What are you going to do now?" Lucy asked after a moment. I sighed, looking out the window as the afternoon sun bathed the streets of Razafa. "I don't know. Everything happened so fast. I need to think, to reorganize." "You can stay here as long as you need," Lucy said firmly. "I insist you do. I don't want you to be alone right now." I nodded gratefully. The thought of facing all this on my own terrified me. "We should call Mom and Dad," Lucy suggested after a pause. I felt a knot in my stomach. I hadn't really spoken to my parents in months. Our calls had become increasingly brief and superficial, a consequence of the isolation James had slowly imposed. "I don't know what to say," I confessed. "Honestly," Lucy said simply, "they love you and will support you. You'll see." With trembling hands, I dialed home. Mom answered on the 3rd ring. "Mary? What a wonderful surprise." Her warm, familiar voice brought tears to my eyes. "Mom," I managed, fighting to keep my composure, "I need to talk to you and Dad." "Are you home?" Her tone softened immediately. "Yes, they're here." "What's wrong, dear? Are you all right?" "Not really," I admitted. "I left James. I'm at Lucy's." There was a long silence, and I feared the worst. Then I heard Mom call Dad, and soon both were on the line. I told them everything, a condensed version of the control, the isolation, how I'd lost myself. I spoke of that morning's incident and my decision to leave. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Dad finally spoke. "My girl," he said, his voice laced with pain, "I'm so sorry. We should have done something. We should have seen the signs. It's not your fault," I replied, echoing what I'd told Lucy. I didn't want to see what was happening. "Listen, Mary," Mom said firmly, "we're incredibly proud of you for taking this step. It won't be easy, but we'll be with you every step of the way. You're not alone." Her words were like a balm for my wounded soul. We talked a while longer, planning to see each other soon. When I hung up, I felt lighter, stronger. Lucy, who had been quietly listening, hugged me again. "See? I told you. You have more support than you think." That night, lying on Lucy's sleeper sofa, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the day's events over and over, imagining what might come next. How would James react when he got home and found me gone? Would he search for me? Should I get a restraining order? I got up and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The city was silent, save for the occasional car passing by. I looked out the window, watching the lights of San Diego twinkle in the distance. This city that had witnessed my love story with James was now the setting for my rebirth. Returning to the sofa, I turned on my phone. There were several missed calls from James and a few messages. I didn't open them. Instead, I scrolled through my photos, images from the past few years, watching my smile fade in each picture. How had I not noticed before? I found a picture of my college graduation, me in my cap and gown, beaming, eyes bright with hope. I remembered that girl, so full of dreams and ambition. Where had she gone? I decided it was time to reclaim her. It wouldn't be easy, I knew. I'd have to rebuild my life from scratch, confront my fears, learn to trust again. But for the first time in ages, I felt I had the strength to do it. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and toast. Lucy was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. I joined her, grateful for this moment of normalcy amid the chaos. "I've been thinking," Lucy said as she poured coffee. "Why don't you go back to teaching? You were always an excellent teacher." The idea both excited and frightened me. "I'm not sure I'm ready," I admitted. "It's been years since I taught." "Then that's all the more reason to start over," Lucy insisted. "I know someone at a language academy. I can ask if they have any openings." I nodded slowly. The thought of doing something I loved again, of earning my own living, was enticing. "All right," I finally said. "Let's do it." We spent the rest of the morning updating my resume, a bittersweet process as I revisited past achievements and realized all the time lost. But it was also liberating, as if I were reclaiming parts of myself I'd forgotten. In the afternoon, Lucy accompanied me as I collected a few more belongings from the house. James wasn't there, probably still at work. Entering the home I'd once called mine felt strange, as if I were intruding on someone else's space. I gathered more clothes, some books, and important documents. In the study, I paused in front of the shelf where I kept my diplomas and certificates. I took them all, they were part of my identity, and I wasn't leaving them behind. Before I left, I stopped in the foyer. A wedding photo of us hung on the wall. I took it down and stared at it for a moment. We were so young, so full of hope. When had everything changed? I left the photo on the dining table along with my house key and wedding ring. I left no note. There were no words that could capture what I felt, and I refused to give James the luxury of knowing my emotional state. I closed the front door with a calm I never thought possible, though inside I was raging. Every step toward Lucy's car felt like a victory, a silent shout for my independence. Back at Lucy's apartment, I sat down to write. I needed to sort out my thoughts, my plans for the future. I wrote about my fears, my hopes, and the dreams I once abandoned. I wrote about the woman I had been and the woman I wanted to be. As I wrote, I realized something important. This wasn't just a farewell to James. It was a farewell to the Mary who allowed herself to be controlled and manipulated. It was the beginning of a new life, one that was entirely mine. That night, before sleep, I looked out the window at the lights of San Diego. The city seemed different now, full of possibilities. Tomorrow would be a new day, the first of my new life. And though I was scared, I was also excited. For the first time in a long while, the future felt like a promise, not a threat. A promise of freedom, rediscovery, and a life that was finally mine. In the days that followed, while I began my new life in Lucy's cozy apartment in Razafa, things back at my old house took an unexpected turn. It wasn't until days later that I learned what had happened, thanks to a call from my neighbor Carmen, who had always been kind to me despite the distance James had imposed. According to Carmen, that afternoon James returned home earlier than usual, accompanied by his sister Sophie and her 3 kids, Mark, age 10, Laura, 8, and little Alex, just 5. The noise of their voices and the clatter of their suitcases filled the normally quiet street of our suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of San Diego. James entered the house, speaking loudly, issuing orders and outlining changes. Sophie, you and Laura can use the master bedroom. Mark and Alex can stay in the guest room. I'll sleep on the office sofa, he declared as he ascended the stairs with a suitcase in each hand. Sophie, looking tired but relieved, tried to keep the kids in line as they ran excitedly around the house. Kids, please behave. Remember, we're here as guests, she reminded them, though her tone suggested that this visit might last longer than expected. But something stopped James cold when he reached the upper floor. A sudden silence fell. Mary, he called out, first in confusion, then with growing irritation. Mary, where are you? James searched every room, calling my name, his voice growing more agitated with each passing second. There was no sign of me. My clothes weren't in the closet, my books were gone, and my makeup bag was nowhere to be found. It was as if I had vanished. He dashed down the stairs, nearly tripping in his haste. His face had drained of color. "She's not here," he said, more to himself than to the others. "She's gone." Sophie, confused, tried to calm him. "What do you mean she's gone? Maybe she went out shopping or to visit someone." But James wouldn't listen. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed my number, once, twice, 3 times. Each time, the call went straight to voicemail. "This can't be happening," he murmured, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "She can't have just left like that without a word." Then he noticed something on the dining table. Approaching slowly as if dreading what he might find, he saw my house key, my wedding ring, and the wedding photo that had always hung in the foyer, all carefully placed. James stared at these objects for what felt like an eternity. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, disbelief, anger, and something akin to pain. Sophie stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "James, what's going on? Where is Mary?" He turned to her, and for a moment it seemed he might break down. But then his expression hardened. "She's gone," he said coldly. "But it doesn't matter. We'll be better off without her." The children, who had until then been unusually quiet, began to ask, "Uncle James, where's Aunt Mary? Does she not live here anymore?" asked Laura. James ignored their questions and headed for the office. "I'm going to make some calls," he said, slamming the door behind him. Sophie stayed in the living room, trying to console the kids and process what was happening. This wasn't how she had imagined her visit. She had expected to find Mary, her kind and helpful sister-in-law, ready to greet them with a smile and perhaps some prepared food. Instead, she found herself amid what looked like the end of a marriage. Meanwhile, in the office, James was furious. He dialed call after call, reaching out to friends, family, even my parents, demanding to know where I was. No one had any answers, or if they did, they wouldn't share them. Finally, frustrated and desperate, he made one last call. "Carlos? It's James. I need your help. Mary's gone and I need to find her." Carlos, an old friend and family lawyer, responded cautiously. "James, calm down. What exactly happened?" James recounted an edited version of events, portraying himself as the victim of my sudden, inexplicable departure. Carlos listened in silence, and after James finished, there was a pause before he replied. "Look, James," he finally said, "I understand you're upset, but legally Mary has every right to leave if she wishes. You can't force her to come back." Those words only enraged James further. "What do you mean I can't force her? She's my wife. She can't just disappear." "James," Carlos said firmly, "I'm telling you as both a friend and a lawyer, the best thing for you to do now is to calm down and wait. If Mary wants to contact you, she will. Forcing things will only make it worse." But James wouldn't listen. He hung up in a fury and stormed out of the office. Sophie, who had been eavesdropping, quickly stepped away from the door. "What are we going to do now?" she asked, worried not only for her brother, but also for her children. James looked at her as if he'd just remembered she was there. "Nothing changes. You all will stay here as planned. Mary doesn't matter anymore." Even as he said that, it was clear he was struggling to keep control. His world was crumbling, and he didn't know how to handle it. The following days were tense in the house. James swung between moments of rage, cursing at me and vowing I'd pay for this, and long periods of silence as he locked himself in the office. Sophie did her best to maintain normalcy for her kids, but it was evident the situation was overwhelming her. More than once, Carmen saw her sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands, worry etched on her face. That night, the tension reached its peak. Unable to accept that his plans had been thwarted, James locked himself in the office with a bottle of whiskey. Sophie, worried for her children and her own future, made a decision. The next morning, when James finally emerged, he found the house silent. Sophie and the kids had left, leaving only a note. "I'm sorry, James, but this isn't healthy for anyone. You need help. Please find it." James was left alone in the house we once shared, surrounded by memories and regrets, finally facing the consequences of his actions. The days at Lucy's place passed with a strange mix of calm and anxiety. On one hand, I felt freer than I had in years. I could make my own decisions, however small, without fearing James's reaction. On the other, I lived in constant fear that he might appear at any moment, demanding explanations or, worse, trying to force me back. Lucy remained an unwavering support. She helped me search for a job, accompanied me to therapy, and even convinced me to resume my old passion for painting. Gradually, I felt I was reclaiming parts of myself I thought were lost forever. Then, on a quiet afternoon while painting on the small balcony of Lucy's apartment, I received the call I dreaded. James's name flashed on my phone, and my heart began to race. I hesitated for a moment, but I knew I would have to face it eventually. With trembling hands, I answered. "Hello?" James's voice thundered on the other end, as furious as I had expected. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is MY House, my life. You can't just decide something like that without my permission." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "James, please, listen to me." But he wouldn't listen. His voice grew louder with every word. "Do you have any idea what you've caused? My sister and her kids are here, and you decide to just vanish without a word. What kind of person does that?" I felt the old Mary, the one who had always shrunk from James's anger, trying to take over. But this time, I wouldn't allow it. With a firm tone that surprised even me, I replied, the kind of person who can no longer bear living in an abusive relationship. The kind of person who has decided to value herself. There was stunned silence on the other end. Clearly, James hadn't expected that. When he spoke again, his voice was a mix of disbelief and scorn. "An abusive relationship? What are you talking about? I've given you everything you ever wanted. You've never lacked anything. Except respect, James," I said, feeling years of repressed frustration boil over. "You've controlled me, isolated me from my family and friends, and made decisions for me as if I were a child. That's abuse." "Don't be ridiculous," James snapped. "You're overreacting. You've always been too sensitive." There he was again, minimizing my feelings, trying to make me doubt myself. But this time, I wouldn't let it happen. "No, James, I'm not overreacting. I've spent years doubting myself, wondering if things were as bad as they felt. But not anymore. I know what I endured, I know how you made me feel, and I'm not going to allow it any longer." Then James began blaming me for everything, the situation with his sister, his work frustrations, even our marital problems. It was the same old pattern, trying to make me feel guilty, manipulating me to come back to him. But this time, I saw it clearly for what it was. "Enough, James," I said, cutting him off. "I'm not negotiating. It's over." "What do you mean it's over?" he asked, his voice mixing anger and panic. "You can't just decide that on your own. We have to talk, we have to fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I replied, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "I've made my decision. I'm not coming back." "And what about the house?" James demanded. "What about our things? You can't just leave and abandon everything." "You can keep the house," I said. "And everything in it. I want nothing of it. I just want my freedom." There was a pause on the line. When James spoke again, his voice had changed, no longer angry, but cold and calculating. "You won't get away with this so easily, Mary. If you think you can just leave and start over as if nothing happened, you're gravely mistaken. I'm going to fight for what's mine." His words sent chills down my spine. I recognized that tone. It was the one he used when planning something, when determined to have his way at any cost. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite my fear. "You'll see," he replied. "This isn't over." And with those words, he hung up. I stared at the phone, panic welling up inside me. What was James going to do? Would he try to track me down? Would he seek revenge? Lucy, who had been listening, came over and hugged me. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "You were incredibly brave." I nodded, grateful for her support, though I couldn't shake the lingering fear his words had left me with. "What am I going to do now?" I asked, more to myself than to Lucy. "Keep doing what you're doing," she replied firmly. "Keep moving forward. Don't let him scare you." You're stronger than you think. The following days were tense. Every time the phone rang, every time someone knocked at the door, my heart skipped a beat. But James didn't call again, nor did he show up at Lucy's apartment. Yet his threat continued to echo in my mind. I knew James wasn't the type to give up easily. If he said he was going to fight, he would. I decided it was time to protect myself. With Lucy's help, I contacted a lawyer specializing in divorce and domestic abuse. Ana Martinez was a middle-aged woman with a kind yet determined look. She listened intently to my story, taking notes and asking questions. "Mary," she said when I finished, "I want you to understand something. What you've experienced is emotional and psychological abuse. It's just as real and damaging as physical abuse. You have every right to protect yourself." Her words validated me in a way I'd never experienced before. For the first time, someone outside my circle told me that what I'd endured wasn't normal, that it wasn't right. Ana explained my options. We could request a restraining order if I felt threatened by James. We could also begin divorce proceedings immediately. But I want you to be prepared, Ana warned. Based on what you've told me about James, he's likely to try to make things difficult. He might manipulate the situation in his favor, try to control our finances, even attempt to discredit you. I nodded, a mix of fear and determination swelling inside me. What should I do? For now, document everything, Ana replied. Every call, every message, every interaction. If you have evidence of his abusive behavior, gather it. And most importantly, stay safe. If you ever feel in danger, call the police. I left Ana's office feeling both stronger and more frightened. That night, sitting on Lucy's small balcony and gazing at the lights of San Diego, I allowed myself to cry for the first time since leaving James. I wept for the naive young woman who had fallen in love with him, for the lost years, for the abandoned dreams. But I also cried with relief, because at last I could see a future without fear, without control, without manipulation. Lucy found me there, silent tears streaming down my cheeks. Without saying a word, she sat beside me and hugged me. We sat like that for a long time in silence as the night fell over the city. "It's going to be all right," Lucy finally said. "You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone." I nodded, wiping my tears. "I know. It's just that sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. If I'm not overreacting, like James says." Lucy looked at me seriously. "Mary, listen to me. You're not overreacting. What James did is not right. You deserve to be happy, to be free. And if anyone tries to take that away, we'll fight it together." Her words comforted me more than I could say. For the first time in a long while, I felt I truly had an ally. The following days were a whirlwind. Following Ana's advice, I began documenting everything: years of controlling texts, manipulative emails, moments when James made me feel small and insignificant. It was painful but liberating. Each piece of evidence confirmed that leaving was the right choice. I also began searching for work with renewed determination. I knew I needed financial independence to face what lay ahead. Lucy helped me update my resume and even practiced interviews with me. Slowly, I felt I was regaining control of my life. A week after James's call, I received an email from him with the subject, "Last Chance." My heart pounded as I opened it. The message was a mix of pleading and threats. James swung between begging me to come back, promising things would change, and warning me of dire consequences if I continued with this madness. He mentioned the house, our joint bank accounts, even hinted he might contact my former boss at school to ensure I wasn't rehired. Fear tried to grip me again, but this time I wouldn't let it. Instead, I forwarded the email to Ana and asked for advice. Her reply came quickly. "Mary, this is exactly the kind of behavior we feared. It's a classic intimidation tactic. Do not respond to the email. We'll use it as evidence for the restraining order and in the divorce proceedings. Remember, you have the legal right to leave an abusive relationship, and no threat from James can change that." That night, sitting in Lucy's modest living room, I made a decision. I wasn't going to live in fear anymore. I wasn't going to let James control my life from any distance. It was time to take charge of my destiny once and for all. With trembling but determined hands, I began to write a letter to James, not to send it, but for myself. To put into words everything I had bottled up for so long. James, for so long I believed I loved you. Now I realize what I felt was fear disguised as love, fear of being alone, of not being enough, of failure. But I'm not afraid anymore. I've discovered I'm stronger than I ever imagined. I'm not coming back. I'm not going to let you control my life any longer. It's over. As I wrote, it felt as if a huge weight lifted from my shoulders. Every word was a declaration of independence, a promise to myself that I would never again allow someone to treat me that way. When I finished, I read the letter once more and then, in a symbolic act, tore it into pieces. I didn't need to send it. The only words James needed to hear would come through my lawyer. That night, I went to sleep feeling more at peace than I had in years. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. James wouldn't give up without a fight, and there would be tough times ahead. But for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to face whatever came. Weeks passed since that final morning coffee with James. Time moved strangely, sometimes dragging, sometimes flying by. During that time, I closed the darkest chapter of my life and opened a new one, filled with uncertainty, but also hope. The first days were the hardest. I woke every morning with a mix of relief and panic, wondering if I'd made the right decision. But with each day, every small step toward independence, I grew more confident in my choice. Lucy remained my rock, my unwavering support. She helped me find a small apartment in the historic Carmen neighborhood in downtown San Diego, a modest but bright space with balconies overlooking narrow, cobbled streets full of life and color. Moving there felt like a rebirth. Every object I placed, every decorating decision, no matter how small, affirmed my newfound freedom. Though adapting to independence wasn't easy, I felt more alive than ever. The sounds of the city, the buzz of nearby bars and restaurants, the chime of cathedral bells all seemed more vibrant, more real than they had in years. I began rediscovering San Diego, the city I loved but had somehow stopped truly seeing during my marriage with James. I wandered the alleys of Carmen for hours, discovering small craft shops, cozy cafes, and hidden corners steeped in history. I visited the Central Market, marveling at the colors and aromas of fresh produce, seafood, and exotic spices. I started cooking again, something I'd stopped because James never liked my food, and experimented with new recipes, filling my small kitchen with delicious aromas and a sense of accomplishment I'd long forgotten. On Sunday mornings, I joined Lucy and some friends for breakfast at a local cafe, enjoying a traditional drink and pastries. Sitting on the terrace, laughing and chatting, I slowly rediscovered myself, perhaps a new, better version of who I once was. Over time, I learned to enjoy solitude. Nights that once felt lonely and frightening became opportunities to read, paint, or simply reflect. I rekindled my old love for watercolor painting, spending hours on my small balcony trying to capture the golden light over the rooftops of Carmen. But the process wasn't linear. There were nights of anguish, days when guilt and doubt overwhelmed me. I wondered if I had been too harsh on James, if I should have given him another chance. In those moments, I reread old texts and emails that had controlled and belittled me, and I remembered why I left. I called Lucy or my parents, who always reminded me how far I'd come. The divorce was long and exhausting. Just as Anna had predicted, James didn't make it easy. He tried to manipulate the situation, threatened to take everything from me, and even attempted to convince mutual friends that I was unstable. But I had the truth on my side, and with the support of Anna, my family, and friends who truly cared, I held my ground. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the legal battle seemed unbearable. But every small victory reminded me I had made the right decision. The first time I won a case in court, when the judge ruled in my favor on asset division, I felt relief and pride that gave me the strength to continue. Freedom has its price, but the outcome is worth it. Every document I signed, every time I faced James in court, I reclaimed a piece of myself. I was no longer the submissive, frightened woman I once was. I was Mary, strong, independent, determined to live on my own terms. While dealing with the divorce, I also began looking for work. It wasn't easy. I'd been out of the job market for years, and my confidence was shattered. But I refused to give in. I updated my resume, attended training courses, and even started learning new skills online. Finally, after months of searching and several disheartening rejections, I landed a position as a Spanish teacher for foreigners at a language academy in downtown San Diego. The day I received the job offer call, I cried tears of joy. At last, I was on my way to complete independence. My first day at work was a mix of nerves and excitement. Walking to the academy with my purse full of books and teaching materials, I felt a surge of pride. I was doing this for myself, building a new life with my own hands. Teaching turned out to be transformative. I fell in love with my profession all over again, savoring every moment in the classroom. Watching my students progress, hearing them speak Spanish with growing confidence, filled me with a satisfaction I'd long forgotten. Every class reminded me that I had something valuable to offer, a part of me that no one could ever take away. Gradually, I surrounded myself with people who treated me with respect and kindness. My colleagues became friends. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I even began going out occasionally, enjoying dinners and concerts without the constant weight of James's judgment over my shoulders. One evening, while dining with Lucy on a terrace in City Plaza, I realized just how much I'd changed. We were laughing, sharing small plates and a bottle of wine, when suddenly I fell silent, overwhelmed by gratitude. "What's wrong?" Lucy asked, noticing my shift in mood. "It's just." "I'm happy," I said, surprised by the simplicity and truth of the words. "Really, truly happy." Lucy smiled, taking my hand across the table. "You deserve it, Mary. You deserve everything." As the months passed, my confidence grew. I no longer shrank when someone raised their voice, nor did I constantly seek approval. I learned to trust my own judgment, to value my opinions and desires. The divorce was finally finalized a year after I left James. The day I signed the final papers, I felt a whirlwind of emotions, relief, a tinge of sadness for what might have been, and overwhelming excitement for what was to come. That night, I hosted a small gathering at my apartment. Lucy, my parents, a few close friends, all were there to celebrate with me. As I watched them laugh and chat in my modest living room, I realized I had built a new family, one founded on love and mutual respect. Later, when everyone had left and I was alone, I stepped onto the balcony with a glass of wine. The San Diego night stretched before me, full of lights and sounds. I thought about the woman I'd been when I met James, the woman I'd become during our marriage, and the woman I was now. Looking back, I felt no resentment, only relief. I had broken free from a marriage that had nullified me, and I learned that there's no greater power than taking control of your own life. James remains a chapter in the past, buried in oblivion, while I step toward a future that is entirely mine. It hasn't been an easy road. There were days of doubt, nights of tears, moments when I wanted to give up. But every obstacle overcome, every fear faced, made me stronger. I learned I was capable of far more than I ever imagined. Sometimes, when I walk the streets of San Diego, I catch myself smiling for no apparent reason. It's the smile of someone who has rediscovered the joy of living, the thrill of endless possibilities. I no longer live in fear of the future, but with anticipation for what's to come. My life is now filled with small joys once taken for granted, the satisfaction of a job well done, shared laughter with friends, the pleasure of a quiet book, the freedom to make my own decisions. Every day is a new opportunity to grow, to learn, to be the best version of myself. I don't know what the future holds, and that's okay. I've learned that life is unpredictable, that plans can change, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. What I do know is that I will face whatever comes with courage and determination, confident in my own strength. Sometimes in class, when I see my students struggle with a new word or concept, I see a bit of my past reflected in them. I remind them that progress isn't always linear, that mistakes are chances to learn, and perseverance is key. And in encouraging them, I'm also reminding myself. I've learned to forgive myself for the years I spent in a situation that hurt me. I now understand that I did the best I could with the tools I had. Most importantly, I learned to love myself with all my imperfections and scars. Every night before I sleep, I take a moment to be grateful for the strength I never knew I had, for the people who supported me, for the lessons learned. I'm grateful for the chance to start over, to write my own story. And every morning, when I see the sunlight filtering through my window, I smile. Because I know that today, like every day since I decided to value myself, is a new opportunity to grow, to love, to live fully. This is my new beginning. And I'm ready for whatever comes next.